Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little less philosophical, but no less fascinating. Sure, you know the pyramids, but not so much about the workers who actually did all the work. It wasn't just simple labour, there was a lot more to it. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I love seeing where all of you are from. Now, let's dive into tonight's story. Congratulations. You've just regained consciousness on the floor of a dusty, overcrowded mud brick hut, and surprise, you're in ancient Egypt. Not the pharaoh kind of Egypt, the backbreaking labour in a rock pit kind. Specifically, it's 2600 BC, and you've been reborn as a low-ranking labourer in one of the largest construction projects in human history. Fancy, right? Wrong. Your alarm clock is a man outside your hut screaming something about Ra's wrath, and swinging what is either a ceremonial staff or a stick used exclusively for hitting people who sleep in. The sun isn't even up yet, but your workday is. You sit up, and your entire spine makes a noise like a papyrus scroll being snapped in half. It's going to be a great day. Around you, 30 other men are also waking up in this delightful windowless box you now call home. The air smells like ancient BO, clay dust, and whatever fermented vegetable sludge someone spilled 3 days ago and just decided to ignore. There's no privacy, no pillows, and definitely no memory foam. Your bed is a slightly raised pile of straw and palm leaves that now has exactly one flattened mouse embedded into it. Nature's heating pad. You take a moment to mourn your modern luxuries, showers, coffee, indoor plumbing, before you're reminded of your new reality by stepping directly into a still warm footprint in the mud floor. You wipe your face with a cloth that could legally be classified as a biohazard and realise with genuine horror that this is your only towel and also your shirt. Next stop, the washroom. It's really just a long, flat basin filled with Nile water, half silt, and at least one dead fish. There's a line, and the guy in front of you is coughing so hard he might pass out. Nobody says anything. You splash your face, hoping to wash off the past 18 hours of heat, sand, and the indescribable smell of manual labour. It doesn't work. Your pores have given up. Getting dressed is easy. You're already in what passes for your uniform. A simple linen kilt, now stiff with sweat and regret. You tie it off with a frayed rope and realise for the 50th day in a row that underwear hasn't been invented yet. There's also no sunscreen, and it's Egypt, so go ahead and mentally prepare for your flesh to slow roast by noon. Outside, the village is coming alive, and by alive, we mean filled with the sound of donkeys braying, people shouting, and at least one man vomiting from dehydration before sunrise. You join a slow-moving herd of workers, shuffling like sandblasted zombies toward the worksite. Nobody's talking. They're all saving their energy, which is smart because they'll need every calorie just to exist in the solar death oven that is the Giza Plateau. You pass the overseer's tent where a well-fed man is sipping date beer and yelling at a slave for improperly stacking baskets of dried fish. He's wearing sandals, gold rings, and the smug face of someone who hasn't lifted a rock in his life. You make eye contact for half a second too long, and now you've earned a friendly reminder in the form of a jab from a wooden staff to your back. You've been up for 20 minutes and you already hate this century. The pyramid site looms ahead, a jagged beast of white limestone blocks stacked sky high. It's still unfinished, but the size is already overwhelming. You and thousands of other workers will be spending the next several decades moving these blocks by hand, without cranes, forklifts, or even decent shoes. You're not special, you're a speck, and you're late. A horn sounds. It's time to report to your work gang. Your legs are sore, your skin is already stinging from the dry wind. You've had zero breakfast. You haven't even gone to the bathroom yet, and honestly, there's a 50-50 chance you won't have time to. You glance up at the rising sun, and for one brief second you think, maybe it'll rain today, but it's Egypt. It won't. Welcome to your first day. You're not even at the quarry yet, so you've made it to the work site. You're sweaty, dehydrated, and already questioning your life choices. But don't worry, it's breakfast time. which sounds nice, until you realise breakfast here isn't avocado toast and an oat milk latte. It's more like, here, take this handful of carbs and pretend it's food. The crew boss yells something about rations and you shuffle into a chaotic crowd of dusty labourers, elbowing each other for what amounts to a primitive buffet line, minus the buffet, the line and the hygiene. Today's menu, surprise, it's bread. Again. And not the soft, fluffy kind that hugs your sandwich. No, this bread is a rock-hard, football-shaped chunk of barley and emmer wheat, baked in an outdoor clay oven by someone who probably hates you personally. It's filled with sand, not metaphorically, literally. Sand. Because ancient flour was ground on stone slabs that shed grit like a cat in summer. Every bite comes with a nice crunch of dental destruction. It's the original toothpick. If you're lucky, there's a dollop of mashed lentils or crushed dates. Unlucky? You're eating dry bread with a side of dry bread. Meat is basically mythical unless you're high up in the food chain, and you, my friend, are not. Chickens aren't a thing yet, and beef is for gods. You might get a small salted fish once a week if your supervisor's in a good mood or has a side hustle in bribery. As you gnaw through the geological sediment that passes for your morning meal, you're given a small clay cup of beer. Yes, beer. Because in ancient Egypt, beer is the one thing everybody gets. But don't get too excited. This isn't your happy hour craft IPA. This is more like liquid bread, made from half-fermented barley, cloudy, sour and thick enough to eat with a spoon. It's warm, of course. Everything here is warm, especially you. Hydration is important though, and this proto-beer is your best hope. The Nile water is full of parasites, so it's beer or dysentery. Choose your fighter. You take a few gulps, get mildly buzzed, and then immediately realise this is your breakfast, lunch and possibly dinner if you're unlucky. And you will be. Oh, and just in case you thought you could sneak in a nap after eating, absolutely not. The overseers are already barking orders, and someone 2 rows over just passed out from heat stroke. Nobody helps him. You finish chewing a stubborn piece of grain that's doing its best impression of cement, take one more sip of sadness beer, and haul your now slightly buzzed, fully exhausted body toward the stone loading zone. The sun is rising, your stomach is turning, and your mouth feels like it's been sandblasted. You're full of despair. Bon appétit. So, your hauling limestone blocks the size of small cars up an incline made of pure rage and gravel. And surprise, you're not doing it fast enough. Maybe you stopped for 2 seconds to wipe the sweat off your brow. Maybe you groaned a little too loud. Maybe, heaven forbid, you coughed. It doesn't matter. Because out of nowhere, your overseer, let's call him Khufu's favourite sadist, is now screaming at you in ancient Egyptian, wielding a stick that looks like it used to discipline crocodiles. Welcome to the punishment system. First rule of Pyramid Club? Don't complain. Second rule, don't stop. Third rule, don't look at the overseer funny. These men are the original workplace supervisors from hell, armed with whips made of tough leather, an ego complex and zero tolerance for slackers, or what they define as slackers, which is essentially anyone who isn't actively sprinting while carrying several tons of stone. And what happens when you really mess up? Maybe you dropped a tool, or broke a chunk off a limestone block, or asked to go to the bathroom. Well, now you've graduated to public discipline. The ancient version of HR will see you now. Except it's outdoors, in front of hundreds of other workers, and it involves a lot more bleeding. The punishment could be as simple as a good old-fashioned beating with a stick, a literal staff of correction that doubles as both symbolic authority and blunt instrument. Or maybe they tie you to a post and give you a dozen lashes while everyone watches, because nothing boosts morale like seeing your co-worker sobbing into the sand. And let's talk about work quotas. If you fail to meet them, and you will, you don't get the afternoon off to reflect. No, you're either forced to keep working past sundown with no extra food, or you're chained up overnight as a lesson to the others. Sometimes both. Sometimes they make you watch your friends get beaten just so you'll feel inspired to move faster tomorrow. Also, let's not forget the ancient Egyptian concept of discipline through public shame. Picture it. You're forced to carry a massive wooden tag on your back that says you're lazy or clumsy, like ancient Yelp reviews, but carved and humiliating. The other workers will jeer, your friends will pretend they don't know you, and your nickname for the next 6 months will be something like Potato Hands. And in the worst case scenario, if you really anger the wrong official, like stealing supplies, arguing or sabotaging a haul, you might find yourself reassigned to the quarries. That's where they send people to really suffer. You'll live underground, hacking rocks out of cliff faces in complete darkness, with nothing but a chisel, a prayer, and the growing awareness that you're never going to see daylight or dignity again. And don't think being injured gets you off the hook. Break a bone? Too bad. Wrap it in cloth and keep moving. Collapse from dehydration? The sun will take care of you. Pass out? Your job becomes body that other people step over. Because here, you're not really a person. You're a cog in a system made of sweat, sand and suffering, and the machine never stops. So next time you think your modern job is hard, just remember, your boss doesn't carry a whip and call you lazy donkey in front of your co-workers while beating you for blinking wrong. So after hauling 2 tons of limestone in 40 degrees Celsius heat, you slipped on a chunk of gravel, twisted your ankle, and hit the ground like a sack of old onions. Congratulations, you're injured. But don't expect sympathy. This isn't modern healthcare. There's no sick leave, no workers' comp, no, let's get you an MRI and ice that. No, this is ancient Egypt, and the medical plan here is rub some crushed garlic on it and try not to die. First off, let's establish one thing. Being injured on the pyramid site doesn't mean you get a break. It means you get to find out how fast you can limp with a dislocated knee while being screamed at. If you're lucky, an overseer might let you crawl to the back of the worker's tent for a quick lay down on a woven mat that smells like everyone else's sweat and feet. If you're unlucky, and you are, you'll be accused of faking it and beaten back into consciousness. Now let's talk treatment. The ancient Egyptians did have medicine, sort of. They had doctors, or sunu, who doubled as priests, which is already a red flag. Because if your treatment plan includes both honey compresses and an exorcism, you're in trouble. Let's say your wound is infected. Well, time for a home remedy. The go-to solution, a mix of mouldy bread, crocodile dung and maybe a spell or two. Is it effective? Questionable. Is it disgusting? Absolutely. But hey, at least your leg smells interesting now. Got a broken arm? Cool. They'll splint it using sticks and linen, which sounds okay until you realise the linen was probably reused from someone's foot wrappings. Pain relief? Nope. You get a prayer to Sekhmet and maybe a dried lizard powder if you know the right people. Anesthetics weren't really a thing, unless you count screaming as a numbing agent. Dental pain? Hope you like suffering. Pyramid workers' diets were full of sand and grit from the bread made with stone ground flour. Your teeth wear down faster than your will to live. Cavities, no drills, no Novocaine. Just grab a chisel and pray. And then there's infection. This is the era before penicillin, before antiseptics, before anyone understood that pus is bad. So when your cut festers and your fever spikes and your co-workers start giving you that he's not going to make it. Look, the only thing coming your way is a quick burial and someone else taking your spot on the rope line. And let's not forget dehydration and heat stroke, both extremely common. The solution? Water, if you can find it. Beer, if you're lucky. But mostly it's just lie in the dirt and try not to die until your body temperature goes back to human. So yeah, no matter what breaks, bleeds or burns, you're either walking it off or you're being replaced. Because you're not special. You're a body, a tool, an asset. And tools don't need doctors. They just need to work until they stop working. So the sun finally goes down, your hands are blistered, your back's on fire, and you've got enough sand in your shoes to start your own mini Sahara. But hey, it's evening now. Surely this is when the fun starts, right? Time for a little entertainment. Except surprise! There's no Netflix, no tavern, no dice game in a cosy pub. You don't even get a stick to poke the fire with and contemplate your life choices. You get Whatever scraps of mental distraction your half-broken co-workers can cobble together while sweating into their linen kilts. Maybe, someone brought a drum made of goat skin and starts banging out a rhythm while another guy sings about how much he misses not being enslaved by a divine sun king. That's about as lively as it gets. Congratulations, you're at the world's saddest open mic night. Some nights, workers would tell stories, myths about gods fighting chaos, tales of Osiris and Set, or just gossip about how the guy 3 rows over fell into the latrine pit and now everyone calls him Dung Boy. Not in hieroglyphs obviously, but you get the idea. Dancing. Technically, yes. If your joints still work and you haven't passed out from dehydration, you could sway a little around a fire pit. Maybe one of the older workers starts clapping along, and for a few minutes, you almost feel something resembling joy, until someone coughs up blood next to you and the mood sort of dies. Games? Sure, the ancient Egyptians had a few, like Senet, kind of a spiritual board game involving sticks and luck and trying to avoid doom in the afterlife. But guess who owned most of the boards? Not you. The supervisors, the nobles, the people not bleeding out under a quarry block. And no, you can't carve your own out of rock, unless you want to spend your only hour of rest chiseling a game instead of sleeping like the dead. Speaking of sleep, that's really the main entertainment. Sweet, sweet unconsciousness. You lie down on a woven mat full of dust and dreams, and try to forget that you have to do it all again tomorrow. If you're lucky, you don't dream about collapsing scaffolding or the overseer's whip. If you're unlucky, well, that's just bonus content. So let's recap. No beer pong, no gladiator fights, no court jesters, just bone-deep exhaustion, bad singing, and the occasional story about Anubis weighing your soul. Because when your daily schedule is carry heavy things until you nearly die, the idea of entertainment gets real minimalist, real fast. The horn blares again, dragging you back to the harsh reality. You shuffle forward, your body already screaming from aches and sunburn. This isn't just a tough job, it's a death sentence disguised as work. You won't survive long here. The sun will scorch your skin until it cracks and bleeds. The dust will choke your lungs. Hunger and thirst will gnaw at you. And if you slow down, the overseer's staff will remind you just how little your life is worth. Decades of this. Impossible. Most won't last a year. Your body will break before the pyramid's even finished. So don't fool yourself. This place doesn't want you alive. It just wants your labour until there's nothing left to give. Late summer in Egypt, around 2525 BC, and the Nile is flooding. To a worker named Merer, the deluge means it is time to bring stone to the site of Pharaoh Khufu's pyramid. The journey from the quarry in Tura, southeast of the port at Giza, is just 8 miles. But the heavy cargo of gleaming white limestone, which will form the outer layer of the monument, makes the crafts difficult to manoeuvre, and the river seems as vast as an ocean when it rises over its banks. Merer has sailed the open seas before, however. The fleet of barges and the 50 men under his command are in experienced hands. He eyes their destination. In the distance he can see the floodwaters lapping against a massive limestone wall. Other boats carrying grain, lumber and livestock sail around the east end of the wall to unload their cargoes in the town there, but Merer's barges aren't going that far. They make landfall north of the wall, where the golden bedrock of the Giza Plateau slopes down to the river, forming a natural ramp that will facilitate moving the limestone to the construction site. From the river's edge, Merer can see what will be the tallest building in the world for at least the next 3,800 years. Thousands of workers swarm across the construction site of the pyramid, which will eventually serve as Khufu's tomb, hauling the giant stones into position and checking and rechecking their alignment. The structure is nearing completion. Soon the upper layers of stone blocks will be in place, and the pyramid will be fully encased in polished Tura limestone and topped with a gilded capstone. Who were the people who built Khufu's pyramid and the pyramids of Egypt's other pharaohs, and why did they devote their lives to the task? Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, thought that the pyramids had been built by armies of slaves motivated by the whips of their overseers. In the past few decades, however, discoveries of other written sources have shown that gangs of Egyptian citizens provided most of the labour. But these sources revealed next to nothing about the lives of those people. For all archaeologists knew, they could have been low-paid labourers who were treated little better than slaves, half-starved, bedraggled men lashed until the limestone was unloaded from the barges onto wood sledges and dragged up to the pyramid. Was she beautiful? Debatable. Was she charming? Probably. Was she politically astute and bent on using both her gender and her outsized power to further her needs? Certainly. Perhaps no historical figure has so inflamed passions and debates than Cleopatra VII. Destined to be the last of her dynasty, the Egyptian pharaoh used seduction and political savvy to further the interests of ancient Egypt in the face of Roman expansion. But though she is one of the best-known women in history, there's little that historians and archaeologists can say for sure about Cleopatra. Here's what is known about the legendary, yet mysterious, queen. Born to Egyptian king Ptolemy XII, Auletes, and an unknown mother in 69 BC, Cleopatra was a member of an ancient Greek dynasty that had taken over Egypt in 305 BC. Though the Ptolemaic kingdom had adopted some Egyptian religious traditions, it ruled from the largely Greek city of Alexandria. As a result, Cleopatra grew up speaking Koine Greek, though she was reportedly the only one of her lineage to also learn Egyptian. Her life would be inextricably bound to unrest in Egypt and the politics of the Roman Empire. When her father died in 51 BC, Cleopatra, then 18, was plunged into a controversy over which of Ptolemy XIV's children should rule Egypt. At first, she ruled jointly with the younger Ptolemy XIII, even marrying him in a nod to Egyptian tradition. But the young king wanted the throne for himself, and civil war soon broke out as they formed factions to help them gain full power. In response, Cleopatra briefly fled to Roman-controlled Syria. Cleopatra's father had been sympathetic to and reliant on Rome during his rule. The warring siblings were no different, and they quickly aligned themselves with different sides in Rome's own brewing civil war. From her exile in Syria, Cleopatra turned to Julius Caesar, then a general and politician intent on becoming Rome's sole dictator, for help regaining her throne. Despite a dramatic age difference, Caesar was about 30 years older than Cleopatra, and the fact that he was married, they began a romantic relationship, and he pledged his support for her. In 47 BC, while fleeing Caesar's troops, Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile River near Alexandria. With Egypt in the hands of Caesar, Cleopatra took back the throne as her own, swiftly married her 12-year-old brother Ptolemy XIV, and declared him her co-ruler. She gave birth to a child her contemporaries assumed to be Caesar's son, whom she named Caesarion. Cleopatra and Caesar's relationship lasted until his murder on the Ides of March in 44 BC at the hands of his enemies in the Senate. Cleopatra had been on an extended visit to Rome at the time of Caesar's murder, and briefly remained there in the hopes of convincing the Romans to recognise Caesarion as the rightful heir of Roman power. Soon, though, she returned to Alexandria, where she's thought to have had her brother assassinated by poison, before taking up her throne once more alongside Caesarion. Caesar was dead, but Cleopatra's relationship with Rome was far from over. Roman general Mark Antony, who had ascended to power as one of Rome's 3 joint leaders, or triumvirs, demanded a meeting with Cleopatra in an effort to continue the Egyptian-Roman alliance. Eager to maintain Egypt's close relationship with Rome, Cleopatra travelled to Tarsus in modern-day Turkey to meet him in 41 BC. Cleopatra is believed to have arrived in Tarsus in high style on a sumptuous barge. Cleopatra invested her ocean excursions with carefully chosen costumes, divine associations, expensive textiles and jewels, music and exotic essences, writes art historian Diana E. Kleiner. The pharaoh meant to impress, and it worked. Almost immediately, she began a torrid love affair with the married Antony, who moved to Alexandria to be with her. But Antony's infatuation with Cleopatra and the reputed excesses of their life in the Egyptian seat of power led to both their downfalls. The Roman ruler plunged into outright war with his co-triumvirs and his own people, who resented what they saw as Egypt's influence in Roman affairs. After a battle in 30 BC, the Egyptian queen realised that Antony's troops were headed to total defeat, so she barricaded herself in her royal mausoleum and told Antony she planned to kill herself. In response, Antony stabbed himself, eventually dying in her arms. Cleopatra attempted to negotiate with Octavian, her lover's former co-ruler, but when she realised he intended to take her captive and parade her in the streets as a prize, she again barricaded herself in her tomb with some servants and killed herself, likely with poison. The rule of her dynasty was over, and Egypt was taken over by Rome. Legend has it that Cleopatra took her life with the help of a poisonous viper called an asp, but there is no proof, nor have archaeologists ever found the mausoleum where she, and likely Antony, died. Was she beautiful? Debatable. Was she charming? Probably. Was she politically astute and bent on using both her gender and her outsized power to further her needs? Certainly. Perhaps no historical figure has so inflamed passions and debates than Cleopatra VII. Destined to be the last of her dynasty, the Egyptian pharaoh used seduction and political savvy to further the interests of ancient Egypt in the face of Roman expansion. But though she is one of the best-known women in history, there's little that historians and archaeologists can say for sure about Cleopatra. Here's what is known about the legendary, yet mysterious, queen. Born to Egyptian king Ptolemy XII, Auletes, and an unknown mother in 69 BC, Cleopatra was a member of an ancient Greek dynasty that had taken over Egypt in 305 BC. Though the Ptolemaic kingdom had adopted some Egyptian religious traditions, it ruled from the largely Greek city of Alexandria. As a result, Cleopatra grew up speaking Koine Greek, though she was reportedly the only one of her lineage to also learn Egyptian. Her life would be inextricably bound to unrest in Egypt and the politics of the Roman Empire. When her father died in 51 BC, Cleopatra, then 18, was plunged into a controversy over which of Ptolemy XII's children should rule Egypt. At first, she ruled jointly with the younger Ptolemy XIII, even marrying him in a nod to Egyptian tradition. But the young king wanted the throne for himself, and civil war soon broke out as they formed factions to help them gain full power. In response, Cleopatra briefly fled to Roman-controlled Syria. Cleopatra's father had been sympathetic to and reliant on Rome during his rule. The warring siblings were no different, and they quickly aligned themselves with different sides in Rome's own brewing civil war. From her exile in Syria, Cleopatra turned to Julius Caesar, then a general and politician intent on becoming Rome's sole dictator, for help regaining her throne. Despite a dramatic age difference, Caesar was about 30 years older than Cleopatra, and the fact that he was married, they began a romantic relationship, and he pledged his support for her. In 47 BC, while fleeing Caesar's troops, Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile River near Alexandria. With Egypt in the hands of Caesar, Cleopatra took back the throne as her own, swiftly married her 12-year-old brother Ptolemy XIV, and declared him her co-ruler. She gave birth to a child her contemporaries assumed to be Caesar's son, whom she named Caesarion. Cleopatra and Caesar's relationship lasted until his murder on the Ides of March in 44 BC at the hands of his enemies in the Senate. Cleopatra had been on an extended visit to Rome at the time of Caesar's murder, and briefly remained there in the hopes of convincing the Romans to recognise Caesarion as the rightful heir of Roman power. Soon, though, she returned to Alexandria, where she's thought to have had her brother assassinated by poison, before taking up her throne once more alongside Caesarion. Caesar was dead, but Cleopatra's relationship with Rome was far from over. Roman general Mark Antony, who had ascended to power as one of Rome's 3 joint leaders, or triumvirs, demanded a meeting with Cleopatra in an effort to continue the Egyptian-Roman alliance. Eager to maintain Egypt's close relationship with Rome, Cleopatra travelled to Tarsus in modern-day Turkey to meet him in 41 BC. Cleopatra is believed to have arrived in Tarsus in high style on a sumptuous barge. Cleopatra invested her ocean excursions with carefully chosen costumes, divine associations, expensive textiles and jewels, music and exotic essences, writes art historian Diana E. Kleiner. The pharaoh meant to impress, and it worked. Almost immediately she began a torrid love affair with the married Antony, who moved to Alexandria to be with her. But Antony's infatuation with Cleopatra and the reputed excesses of their life in the Egyptian seat of power led to both their downfalls. The Roman ruler plunged into outright war with his co-triumvirs and his own people, who resented what they saw as Egypt's influence in Roman affairs. After a battle in 30 BC, the Egyptian queen realised that Antony's troops were headed to total defeat, so she barricaded herself in her royal mausoleum and told Antony she planned to kill herself. In response, Antony stabbed himself, eventually dying in her arms. Cleopatra attempted to negotiate with Octavian, her lover's former co-ruler, but when she realised he intended to take her captive and parade her in the streets as a prize, she again barricaded herself in her tomb with some servants and killed herself, likely with poison. The rule of her dynasty was over, and Egypt was taken over by Rome. Legend has it that Cleopatra took her life with the help of a poisonous viper called an asp, but there is no proof, nor have archaeologists ever found the mausoleum where she, and likely Antony, died. You wake up in the dark, not because it's nighttime, but because there's no light in your barracks. Just the sound of coughing, lots of it. Someone's hacking up something that might have once been a lung. It's minus 30 degrees Celsius outside, and not much warmer inside. Your blanket is thinner than a Soviet excuse for why you're here. A guard kicks the door open and yells something that basically translates to get up or get hit. So you get up. Your clothes, not yours. Just some itchy, lice-ridden uniform 3 other guys probably died in. No socks. Your boots don't match. One leaks. Both are frozen. Your breakfast is a ladle of something grey. It might be food, or it might be punishment. No one's really sure anymore. You're marched outside into the snow with your work group. You're assigned to logging today, which sounds peaceful, until you realise you're doing it with a blunt axe and no gloves. Your fingers stop working after 10 minutes. You stop complaining after 15, because someone did, and now they're not here anymore. Around hour 4, someone collapses. The guards drag him away. No one asks where. Everyone already knows. You try to keep pace. Because if you're too slow, you get less food tomorrow. And if you get less food, you work slower. Then you get less food again. It's a fun little loop called starvation. Very popular in the gulags. You make it to lunch. It's soup again. Hot, technically. Tastes like regret and cabbage. You think about asking for more, then remember last week when someone did that. You haven't seen him since. You assume he's now part of the soup. The afternoon is more logging. Your hands are bleeding now, but that's good. Bleeding means they're still attached. The guy next to you lost 2 fingers last month. He wrapped them in rags and just kept going. He's kind of your hero now. At sunset, you'll march back. You pass a group digging a trench. You don't ask what for. It's always safer not to know. Dinner is the same as breakfast. So's the coughing. So's the cold. Lights out. Not that you had lights. You lie in the dark, covered in lice and frostbite, and listen to someone weep quietly in the bunk below. It's his birthday. He just turned 22. He looks 50. So? You're sitting on a wooden bench that somehow feels colder than the snow outside. Your hands are shaking, your fingers are stiff, and your stomach feels like it's trying to digest itself. Congratulations. It's mealtime. Kind of. The gulag doesn't do menus. You don't pick your meal. You just hope it doesn't wriggle. Breakfast is a ladle of kasha, which is like porridge. But if porridge gave up on life and decided to become glue, it's usually made from barley or millet, but don't get excited. The grains are undercooked, The water's dirty, and if there's a lump of fat in it, that's basically Christmas. There's no sugar, no milk, and the closest thing to flavour is the wooden spoon you use to eat it. Sometimes you get a chunk of bread. It's dark, dense, and about as nutritious as a brick. You don't chew it so much as gnaw on it and pray your teeth hold out. If you're lucky, there's a pinch of salt in the entire loaf. If you're really lucky, there's no mould. But let's be honest, you eat the mould anyway. It's the only colour in your diet. Lunch is soup, always soup. It's hot. Not warm, not tasty, just hot enough to remind you you're still alive. The base is water. The flavour? Uncertainty. It might have a shred of cabbage in it, or a single bean, or on rare holidays an actual piece of meat, so small you mistake it for a dirty fingernail. The other prisoners call it soldier soup, because you could march all day and still starve to death. If you worked really hard in the morning, and by really hard I mean until your fingernails split and your joints lock up, you might get an extra half ladle. Maybe. Or the guard might eat it in front of you. That's also part of the fun. There's a slice of bread again. Same one as this morning. Still brick. Still delicious. Still your best friend. Dinner is, well, it's breakfast. And lunch had a very bitter, very watery child. It's grey. It's vague. It's something that makes you nostalgic for your worst meal back home. Remember that gas station sandwich you once ate at 3 a.m. and regretted for a week? Yeah, that was Michelin star cuisine compared to this. There's sometimes a piece of fish. Technically, it's been salted so hard it could be used as a weapon. No one's quite sure what kind of fish it is, and no one asks. You just eat it before it eats through your metal bowl. Oh right, bowls. You get one. You guard it with your life. If someone steals it, you're done. If it breaks, you're done. No bowl means no food, and no food means, you guessed it, done. You'd think people might steal each other's meals. They don't. Not because they're kind, but because the guards would beat you senseless for upsetting the food line. Steal food, and you're either dead or transferred to punishment rations, which is just a fancy way of saying, we're not feeding you anymore, but we'll still work you to death. Now, vitamins. You don't get them. Everyone has scurvy. Everyone's gums bleed. Teeth fall out like autumn leaves. You learn to chew on birch bark or pebbles just to feel something in your mouth. By week 2, your hunger becomes a background noise. By week 3, you start hallucinating roast chickens. By week 4, the hallucinations stop, because your body's now using the last of its muscle tissue just to keep your heart going. Could you survive on gulag rations? Technically yes, for a while. But you'll be skinnier than a Soviet excuse for invading Finland, and you'll be dreaming of food so obsessively that even rat meat will start to look gourmet. Bon appétit. So, you've been starving for weeks, sleeping on frozen planks, breaking rocks with a pickaxe that should have been retired in 1902, and your body's so broken you can't tell if your foot hurts or if it's just gone. But then, oops, you messed up. Maybe you spoke too loud. Maybe you sat down for 5 seconds too long. Maybe the guard was just bored. Doesn't matter. In the gulag, suffering isn't a side effect, it's the point. Let's start with the basic punishments, for those cute little infractions like talking in line, or walking too slow because your legs are literally frostbitten. First up, the cold box, also called the isolator. It's a tiny wooden cell, usually with zero insulation, no windows, and a door that seals tighter than your fate. You're tossed inside with nothing, no coat, no blanket, no food, and left there for a day, or 2, or a week, in winter, Siberian winter, the kind of cold that makes metal snap and blood crystallize. Some prisoners wished they'd freeze to death in there. Most didn't. Most just came out with damaged lungs, blackened fingers, and a smile that said, "I've seen the void, and it was colder than this soup." Didn't learn your lesson? Great. Here comes the pit. It's exactly what it sounds like. A hole in the ground, covered with planks. You're shoved in there like an inconvenient secret and left alone, in the dark, with the rats and your thoughts. There's no standing up. There's no lying down. You sit and freeze and sit and regret ever being born. Still not enough? Let's talk beatings. No trial, no explanation. Just a sudden crack to the skull with a rifle butt or a wooden baton. Some guards get creative. They beat you with sticks, with frozen ropes, with whatever's handy. One guy got whipped with telephone wire. Why? Because he asked for toilet paper. A real crime against the Soviet Union. And here's the fun part. They don't beat you to kill you. That would be merciful. They beat you to hurt, but not end. The idea is to make an example, to show everyone else what happens when you forget your place in this icy hellhole. Now, if you really screw up, like escape attempts, sabotage, or God forbid sarcasm, then you graduate to punishment brigades. Imagine the hardest labour in the camp. Now double it. You're sent to chop timber in the taiga, waist deep in snow, with no gloves. Or you're made to carry massive logs uphill while wearing torn boots. No breaks, no water, no food except half a frozen potato if you're still breathing by nightfall. Most didn't make it a week. Some didn't make it to lunch. And if you're caught trying to escape, you don't get beaten, you don't get put in the box, you just disappear. Shot in the woods, buried in a shallow grave. No one asks questions. No one ever even says your name again. Because here's the brutal truth. In the Gulag, you're not a person. You're a number, a statistic, a pair of lungs wasting Soviet air, and if you can't pull your weight, or if you so much as breathe wrong, they will replace you. The only thing cheaper than food here is you. Let's say you've made it this far. Your fingers are frostbitten, your ribs are poking through your skin like they're trying to escape, your cough sounds like a dying accordion, and your leg's been broken since Tuesday. But you're still breathing, technically, so you figure, hey, maybe it's time to see a doctor. Oh, sweet child, that's adorable. Welcome to Soviet Gulag Healthcare, proudly sponsored by Band-Aids, Hope and Communism. Let's start with the basics. There were no real doctors. Sometimes, if you were lucky, there was a prisoner who used to be a doctor 10 years ago, before his anti-Soviet biology lectures got him locked up. But by the time he's working in the camp hospital, he's blind in one eye and hasn't touched clean tools since Stalin had a moustache worth trusting. Medical supplies? Ha! You'll get a dirty rag, a splintery wooden stretcher, and maybe, a half-used syringe they also used to drain pus from the guy with typhus. And forget antibiotics. If you get an infection, you just ride it out. Like a feverish cowboy, only the horse is dysentery and it's dragging you through 6 feet of snow. The most common treatment in the Gulag? Observation, which means they watch you die. They put you in the so-called hospital barrack, a wooden shack with no heating, and more lice than pillows, and wait to see if you're strong enough to crawl back to work or just expire quietly in the corner. You got scurvy? Chew on your own boot leather? Got trench foot? Cut it off yourself. The sore's over there by the blood-stained wall. You've gone half blind from malnutrition? That's fine. You don't need eyes to dig holes, but the worst part, you didn't want to go to the hospital, because the hospital meant you couldn't work. And if you couldn't work, your food ration got cut, down to starvation levels, so if you thought getting pneumonia was bad, try getting pneumonia and only being fed a crust of bread every 48 hours. So yeah, prisoners would literally hide their wounds, bind their own limbs with torn shirts, stuff raw meat into open cuts to keep them from rotting, because even dying slowly was better than being treated. And when people died in the hospital, their bodies were stripped, dumped and replaced before the mattress even cooled. Sometimes your only chance at rest was in a bed someone else just died in. Some prisoners pretended to be sick to escape work. Those guys, if caught, they were punished twice. First, for being lazy. Second, for wasting the state's valuable imaginary medicine. Bottom line, if you get sick in a gulag, there is no medicine, there is no healing, there is only pain. And the hope that you die fast, or that someone sicker than you crawls in and takes your place on the floor. Because in the Soviet gulag, healthcare wasn't about saving lives. It was about sorting out the weak and clearing space for the next broken body in line. Gus, you've made it through another soul-crushing 14-hour shift digging frozen dirt. Your fingers are black with frostbite, your stomach's growling like a bear in mating season, and your lungs are coughing up particles of despair. But hey, it's evening now. Surely it's time for some well-earned leisure. Welcome to Gulag Entertainment, where the only thing more dead than your sense of hope is the guy who tried to tell jokes last week. Let's break down your options. Option 1. Collapse. The number one most popular evening activity was simply passing out on a lice-infested wooden bunk while still half-dressed. This required no equipment, no talent, and no will to live, which made it ideal for 100% of prisoners. Option 2. Listening to someone weep quietly into their soup. Nothing builds camaraderie like mutual despair. Someone sobbing into their cabbage water about the family they'll never see again. That's your nightly podcast. Option 3. Cultural enrichment. Once in a blue moon, usually when a high-ranking officer needed to show off, the camp would host a performance. This meant dragging out a prisoner who used to play violin, or read poetry, or had a decent baritone before his teeth fell out. They'd recite Pushkin or sing a Soviet anthem, while the guards glared with rifles and the prisoners sat too tired to clap. It was less a concert and more a reminder of what actual life used to feel like before the cold ate your soul. Option 4. Story time. This was the Gulag's version of Netflix. Old prisoners would whisper stories about their lives before the camps. Some were lies, most were sad. All were told in hushed tones while trying not to get caught conspiring, because even talking too much could be considered suspicious behaviour. Option 5. Rat chasing. Yes, seriously. If you had a spare burst of energy, or needed protein that didn't come from your imagination, you could go after rats with a stick. Catch one, you're tonight's chef. Miss? Congrats, now you've got fleas. Option 6. Gambling. No chips, no cards, no house rules. Just desperate men betting chunks of their food rations on literally anything. Arm wrestling, cockroach races, how long it would take the new guy to cry. Spoiler, not long. Option 7. Dreaming about escape. This wasn't entertainment in the fun sense, more like a nightly ritual of mentally replaying your arrest, trial, sentencing, and the absurd idea that maybe, just maybe, someone on the outside would remember you exist. Of course, you couldn't talk about escape. That would land you in solitary, or worse. But in your head, every bunk became a portal to some fantasy where you were warm, free, and not eating bread made of sawdust. And finally, option 8. Watching people go mad. Some prisoners would start laughing uncontrollably, others would talk to invisible people, dig imaginary tunnels, or scream in their sleep every night until their voice gave out. At some point, the mind breaks, and when it does, everyone just scoots over a bit and lets it happen. Because in the Gulag, entertainment wasn't about joy, it was about distraction. Just something, anything, to make you forget you're living in one of the cruelest systems ever designed by man, where survival itself was a twisted form of resistance, and the only comedy was how long you could keep going. So, would you survive a day in a Soviet gulag? Sure. If you're immune to cold, starvation, forced labour, disease, psychological torture, beatings, isolation, betrayal, and existential dread, then yeah, you'd be just fine. But for the other 99.9999% of us, you wouldn't last. Not because you're weak, but because the gulag was designed to break people. It didn't matter if you were innocent, strong, smart, loyal, or lucky. Everyone went in thinking they could survive. Most came out as ghosts, if they came out at all. And what's worse, it wasn't just about punishment, it was about control, about fear, about making sure no one ever asked questions again. So next time you're upset because your phone died or Starbucks ran out of oat milk, just remember, at least you're not getting 10 years of hard labour for telling a joke about Stalin's moustache. Sleep tight. Don't dream of barbed wire. A rare survivor of the harshest Stalin-era labour camps has died aged 89 in Russia's Far East. Vasily Kovalyov had survived icy punishment cells and beatings in the USSR's notorious Gulag prison system. During an escape attempt in 1954, he spent 5 months hiding in a freezing mine with 2 other prisoners. Kovalyov's story was featured in Vesma, a news site based in Magadan. The communist regime shipped thousands of enemies to prison camps via Magadan. In 1950, Kovalyov, aged 20, was found guilty of anti-Soviet sabotage, one among the millions of victims of Stalinist terror. An old sabre that he had used to chop vegetables was enough to condemn him. First, he was sent to Norilsk, in the Russian Arctic, he told Vesma, but he ended up in Kolyma, a notoriously harsh network of labour camps north of Magadan, after guards uncovered an escape plot. In 1954, he and 2 other inmates hid in a mine and prepared an armed uprising. but someone tipped off the guards, who then came looking for them. Miners who knew the place inside out accompanied them and said we wouldn't be able to stand the permafrost there longer than a week, he told Vesma. They blocked all the entrances with grills. We spent 5 months underground, in the dark, starving. After 3 months we had eaten all our food, and in the end we were chewing wood shavings. He said they managed to dig a way out through the permafrost and emerged half-blind like moles. They made it to a nearby town but were arrested there. During a punishment beating, the guards let loose a huge sheepdog on him, he said. It leapt at me, but I had protective metal studs on my boots and kicked the dog down. In a flash I dived at its throat and bit hard. I heard a crunch and the dog shuddered, then died. Millions died during Joseph Stalin's dictatorship, in deportations, famine, forced collectivization, executions and prison camps. The terror he unleashed involved massive purges of the Communist Party and state institutions. Kovalyov was released in 1957, when Stalin's successor Nikita Khrushchev declared an amnesty for Gulag prisoners in the post-Stalin thaw. He stayed in Magadan, where he worked as a heating engineer, and he took a Vesma reporter, Yevgeny Radchenko, on a tour of the grim prison, a ruin still reeking of cruelty. He died of a stroke in a Magadan hospital on Monday. According to Vesma, until his last breath, he never forgot what the Soviet Union did to millions of people who endured the camps, leaving their best years, their health and their lives there. He told the story of his trip back to Odessa region, where he met the people who had put him in prison. He did not forgive them. The cruelty and torment of camp life taught him to survive, but at the same time to stay human. Very few Kolyma prisoners from the Stalin period are still alive, a Russian historian told the BBC. Alyona Kozlova, chief archivist at the Memorial Documentation Center, said, I know of 3 in Moscow, and it's possible that he was the last one in Magadan. But about 4 million ex-Soviet citizens are alive today who spent some time in Stalin's prisons, she said. Clowns, buffoons, fools, jesters, jokers, of one kind or another, have been part of the history of almost every culture in civilization. The comic actors of the Roman Empire are probably the direct predecessors of the jesters of the Middle Ages. Although there were no professional jokers at that time, comic actors are likely to have been the forerunners in both their style of comedy and attire. Many Roman emperors decided to rid their empire of actors, claiming them to be damaging to society. Whilst fleeing persecution, those performers spread their trade all over Europe, possibly leading to the development of the jester in later years. Although it should be noted that jesters were prevalent in other countries such as China and India, the wish to be entertained and the need to laugh was, and still is, universal. During the medieval period, lucky jesters were the ones who were employed by nobles or royalty to perform at court. But he or she wasn't just an entertainer. They were part of the social fabric of a region. Court jesters were valued with great privileges. Let's travel back in time and take a look at the life of a medieval jester. Welcome to medieval madness. Between the 12th and 17th centuries, the term minstrel, meaning little servant or gleeman, described any person who was a professional entertainer of any sort. This included acrobats, jugglers, and even storytellers, but more specifically, musicians. During the Middle Ages, many of these minstrels toured from place to place, staying for a short time in a town or village whilst business was good. Although some of the most talented and well-respected were permanently employed at the royal court or by other rich households, whilst they were able to command a high salary, these minstrels could be found across the whole of Europe. In France, they were known as jongleurs or troubadours. In Germany, minnesingers. They were called skops in England, skalds in Scandinavia, and bards in Ireland. Travelling from place to place, they not only provided a source of entertainment with their ballads and stories, but also served as a way of delivering the news. Information from the villagers would be shared with the minstrel, who would impart this news to the townsfolk in the next village they performed at. During the period of the Middle Ages, a person's station in life was governed by the family that they were born into. A blacksmith would teach his sons how to be blacksmiths, as with a stonemason. A peasant would remain in the lowest social rank. But the European jester could come from any background. There might be a clerk whose fooling around had amused a noble, a cottager who was known for their wit and joke-telling, or even an ex-monk who had been expelled from the abbey for their antics. It wasn't easy being a jester. It was a job that required intelligence and quick-wittedness. A fantastic memory was essential for memorising epic poetry, heroic stories, or even just the news that you spread between villages. There was also a need to be able to improvise and adapt depending on the audience. Children would want to hear pretty lullabies, whilst older people would prefer a retelling of some bloody war story or another. Tact was also a requirement. A jester needed to appear whenever needed but fade into the background when required, a skill in itself. Jesters were given free rein to say whatever they liked, but they had to be careful not to upset too many people or go too far. There were two sorts of fools, natural and artificial or licensed. Either way, those that had physical deformities, such as misshapen limbs, hunched backs, or exceptionally ugly faces, were particularly valued, as were dwarfs. They used their physical appearance to their advantage to gain extra laughs. There are stories of natural fools being recruited from poor families as they were thought to have been touched by God. A disabled child or adult would be a huge financial burden to a peasant family, and it would have been a great help to have them taken on and cared for by a wealthy one. The fool would be unpaid but provided with clothes, bed and board. Once these poor souls were no longer amusing to the household, they were cast out. Although some were given alms regularly, most sadly ended their days as beggars. The tradition of having a fool at court dates back much further than the Middle Ages. They were employed not just for entertainment, but also to ease the mental pressures for both the monarch and his nobles. In this way, the jester would help their employer to focus better on their duties and political affairs. By the end of the 12th century, the name fool began to be used when describing a jester who had earned payment in the manner of land, as well as the freedom to leave court, although they did have to agree to return as and when required. During the medieval period, court jesters were held in great esteem, especially in the royal household. This prized position meant that they could tease their patron without causing too much offence, often speaking the harsh truth to their superiors disguised as humour. This ability was known as the jester's privilege, and although people laughed at their silly stories, they also listened to the truths hidden within. Underneath the folly was usually a lot of common sense and cleverness. It was a complex job that required much thoughtfulness, insight and discretion, as the jester of Philip VI of France found out in 1340. Edward III of England defeated the fleet of the French king Philip VI at Sluy. Of course, no one wanted to give Philip the bad news. It was left up to his fool, who, once in the king's presence, was heard to mumble, "Those cowardly Englishmen, those chicken-hearted cowards." How so?" asked the king. "Why? Because they had not courage enough to jump into the sea like your own sailors, who went headlong from your ships, leaving them to the enemy who did not dare to follow them. Court was often controlled by fear and insincerity, and it was essential that the truth be dressed up as silliness, in order for it to be accepted. It's impossible to know how many crazy ideas a jester had discouraged by whispering into the king's ear, or how many calamities were caused because of his bad advice. As far as physical entertainment went, singing, dancing, acrobatics and juggling were all indispensable skills for the jester, as well as being able to play an instrument, perform ventriloquism, puppetry and sleight of hand. Even when carrying out their main job, that of making their employer laugh, part of the comic appeal of the jester was their traditional costume, which was also meant to cause amusement. During the early medieval period, it was not unusual for the head to be completely shaved. Then they would wear a hat with the ears of a donkey on top of their head. Some would also wear a donkey's tail as well. Later, a cowl was worn, similar to that of a monk, which would fall off onto the shoulders to give them a comical look. This hood was usually topped off with a cock's comb, the comb of a rooster, which was traditionally used to adorn a fool's headpiece. By the late medieval age, the hat had evolved. Made from soft cloth, it now had 3 points, representing the ass's ears worn in the earlier period. A jingling bell was fastened onto the end of each point. Called the cap and bell, this is the design that we associate with a fool's hat today. They might also carry a type of pretend sceptre known as a bauble or marotte. with a carved miniature grinning head on the end. It would often be made to look like the jester themselves, and was also adorned with a cap and bell. Some fools carried a mock weapon such as a wooden sword, an inflated bladder on a stick filled with peas to make a type of large rattle, or a padded club. These types of props were used to add extra quirkiness to their cavorting. A motley coat or tunic was worn, made from bright mismatched colours such as red and green or yellow and blue. This was meant to highlight a lack of symmetry and give emphasis to the mayhem and unpredictability of the fool. Many also had bells around the skirt or at the elbow so that the jester could be heard tinkling wherever they went. Bi-coloured, tightly fitting breeches and stockings were worn on the legs. The whole outfit was usually designed by the fool themselves and had to be maintained regularly. In contrast, the natural fool would usually be dressed in a long gown. The role of messenger was also part of the job description for a personal jester to a king or nobleman. They would go into battle with their master and the rest of the troops and deliver messages to the opposing side, such as terms of surrender or conditions for the liberation of hostages. Jesters were traditionally thought to be sacred, and it was customary for them not to be harmed in any way. But that was not always the case. If the message happened to be something that the opposing army did not want to hear, it would be the fool that suffered the consequences. It was not unusual for the angry leader to shoot the messenger right back at the enemy by loading him into a catapult or trebuchet. It was to be hoped that the jester would have already been killed beforehand, and that it was their severed head that would fire back. But sometimes, unfortunately, it was a live fool that was sent airborne. However, one minstrel who showed himself to be more than just the average jester was the Norman dwarf named Taillefer. He was a French jongleur who travelled over from France with William the Conqueror during the Norman conquest. By mid-battle, the French were becoming weary and in danger of defeat. On horseback, Taillefer juggled a sword while singing the Song of Roland at the English troops during the Battle of Hastings. His antics caused one English soldier to break ranks from the shield wall. Taillefer saw his opportunity and attacked the Englishman, decapitating him. He then charged at the English line, killing more enemies before he was overcome. Taillefer is credited with lifting the spirits of the French army, which then rallied and won the battle, and subsequently the kingdom. And he is not the only jester of note. Many were quite powerful and had great influence throughout medieval society. Roland the Farter was court jester to King Henry II of England in the 12th century. Actually an accomplished flautist, he was famous for the art of breaking wind and was especially sought after during Henry's Christmas festivities. There, the charmingly named jester would perform a simultaneous fart, whistle, and jump. Roland was so well respected by his king that he was rewarded with the 30-acre Hemmingston Manor, as well as an annual payment. At the court of Edward I, known as Longshanks, Tom the Fool was awarded the huge sum of 50 shillings because he performed so well at the wedding of Princess Elizabeth. Many others were also able to take advantage of their position and turn their good fortune into wealth, helping to obtain profitable deals and jobs for friends and family. Another jester who was determined to make the most of his skills was Rahere. Using his wit, he became invaluable to the nobility and was referred to as a minstrel. He was particularly good at making fun of people and spreading outrageous gossip behind their backs, amusing everyone who was listening. Not only did he perform clerical work, but he also became jester to King Henry I in the early 1100s. Rahere would at times adopt the behaviour of an idiot, which greatly entertained the servants and children. He is reported to have fallen ill on a pilgrimage to Rome, where he had a vision of St. Bartholomew. On his return to London, he founded the hospital of the same name to create a sanctuary for those less fortunate. In China, Shen Jiangoa, also known as gradually stretching taller, was employed as a jester during the 10th century in the state of southern Tang. He was so influential that he was able to make the emperor Li Bian reduce taxes. In the midst of a drought, he made a joke that even the rain was afraid of being taxed and would not come into the land. Li Bian was so amused that he cut taxes immediately. Legend has it that that very night Shen is also believed to have saved the emperor's life. Li Bian invited his enemies, Al Ben, to a banquet. then sneaked poison into a goblet of wine before he offered it to Li Bian for a toast. Shen quickly grabbed the cup and, sacrificing himself for his emperor, drank the poisoned wine himself. Despite being given an antidote, sadly, Shen died from a burst brain. Whereas, in Saxony, Germany, rather than being looked at as a clown, Klausner was regarded as being a wise man during the late 15th century. Much was written about him, and he was known for his moral stories and parables. He's even thought to have been able to predict the future. During the Middle Ages, women were considered the property of their fathers or husbands, and had very few privileges. But some were lucky enough to become successful as jesters. For them it meant they had the freedom to insult men of power without consequence. The job was one of the few that was completely open to women, who could enjoy the same benefits as men without any stigma. Many female jesters accompanied the queens and ladies of court, such as Archerwood de Poix, who was fool to Jeanne, the Queen of Charles I of France, in 1373. We know that Jeanne paid the large amount of 170 gold francs for a dress for Archerwood, who was obviously well cared for. Another female jester was Madame d'Or, who entertained everybody at the Festival of the Golden Fleece in 1429 in Bruges de Belgium. Margaret, the granddaughter of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, also had a female fool who was allowed to sit in a chariot with the ladies in waiting when travelling with her mistress. One nameless female jester arrived at the court of Edward II, who was celebrating the festival of Whitsuntide at the Hall of Westminster in 1316. She trotted into the hall on a horse and rode around telling jokes to the king and his eminent guests. At the end of her performance, she approached the king and placed a letter in his hand before graciously riding away. The letter actually contained a petition of complaint against the abundant favour that the king had lavished upon the undeserving, while his faithful knights and trusty servants were neglected. No one else would have dared to hand over this letter, but jesters were allowed free access everywhere. Perhaps this female fool was also aware of King Edward's love of any joker who could ride a horse, or to be more precise, could fall off of a horse. He previously paid one jester who continually tumbled from his mount the princely sum of 20 shillings, double that of another fool who could only dance for his king. Some of the customs that we now enjoy during the Christmas period date back to the Middle Ages and before. Singing carols, giving gifts, decorating homes, and overindulging were all part of the medieval festivities. The Lord of Misrule was a respected position within noble houses and at the royal court. The jester would be expected to play the role over Christmas. It was a demanding job. Festivities needed to be organised properly to guarantee that everything went well, and the reign of the Lord of Misrule could last anywhere from 12 days to 3 months. There were masked parties, the possession of the Yule log, and feasts that all needed to be planned. Sometimes the festivities would include mummers' plays. The origins of mumming date even further back than the Middle Ages, through Europe and into Russia. Medieval mummers were a group of travelling actors who would perform religious plays at Christmas, travelling from house to house. Most of the plays had a biblical theme, but were mainly for entertainment. So the medieval jester was valued, not just endured. Their relationship with the townsfolk and those at court was often warm and friendly. Ever the diplomat, they were the voice of reason for many monarchs who were brought up to believe that they had divine rights and were answerable to no one except God. They could save an innocent from the king's fury with just the telling of a joke, therefore saving the king from himself. Although their verbal attacks could be scathing, there was usually an undercurrent of compassion and real insight. The fool was on the side of the ordinary people, fighting against oppression, making them liked by all, whether lord or peasant. When we think of crime and punishment in the medieval period, we often think of a chaotic system of judgment and brutal punishments that seem out of proportion with the seriousness of the crime. In medieval Europe, law and order was harsh. It was assumed that people would only behave well if they feared the penalty of breaking the law. There was a gibbet on the outskirts of most towns in England. There, criminals would be hanged, their bodies left to rot for many weeks as a stark warning as to the reality of breaking the law. However, this obviously wasn't the great deterrent that the establishment hoped it would be. In just 1 year, the northern city of Lincoln had 114 murders, 89 robberies with violence, and 65 woundings. Considering Lincoln had a population of just 7,000 people in 1202, those numbers seem quite high. And when you also consider that only 2 people were executed for these crimes, it would seem that a lot of medievals were getting away with their offences. Blasphemy. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church was a dominant force, and many countries maintained order by imposing religious or canon laws on the people, as well as those decided by the monarch. Refusing to acknowledge God or offering up any ideas not sanctioned by the Church was considered to be blasphemous. The Dominican friar and philosopher Thomas Aquinas amazingly considered blasphemy, quote, a sin more grave than murder, because it was directed against God rather than against one's neighbour. This view was also considered true by the medieval leaders of Islam too. In Kuwait, punishment was as brutal as it could get, with stoning, burning at the stake, or having an elephant crush your head being the standard penalty. Across medieval Europe, there were many terrible punishments for the offence, including garroting in Spain, mutilation in Germany, and flogging or branding in England. Unfortunately, it was very easy to commit the sin of blasphemy. Just a tiny slip in the company of the wrong person could result in someone suddenly becoming an unwitting criminal. Murder. Why the Middle Ages in Europe was so violent has often been debated. Historians have argued that almost everyone had witnessed a murder or knew someone who had been killed. It claimed that in the Oxford or London of the medievals, you were more likely to be murdered than die by accident. Getting away from the scene of the crime after a murder was quite easy. There were large areas of woodland and countryside between urban settlements in medieval Europe, giving the perpetrator the perfect opportunity to flee the scene, and the chances of getting caught were small. Law enforcement was practically non-existent, although some Italian city-states were lucky enough to have salaried police officers. Theft. The medievals stole for many reasons, just as people do so today. Theft was probably one of the most common crimes committed during the Middle Ages. Just like murderers, the medieval thief could easily slip away unnoticed. How crimes were perceived and the severity of the punishment given seemed to depend on where the offence was committed. In 1353, in the village of Mihavel, southern France, a woman was washing her clothes in the local stream, leaving the items to dry on a frame. She returned to find that her cloak had been stolen. A young man of 15 was arrested for the crime. A few days later, he was found guilty of the theft at court, and he was banished from the village for 3 months. In the London of 1417, a man named Edmund H. Chappell from the district of Finsbury was indicted for the robbery of a horse, 4 bolts of cloth, and some other goods. He was found guilty by a jury and sentenced to hang. The crimes are quite similar, but the punishments are worlds apart. It would seem that there were huge variations in what penalties were deemed appropriate depending on the location. In 1321, the Warrant family were making a nuisance of themselves in the rural village of Seoul in Norfolk, England. Firstly, 3 of the siblings, sisters Marjorie and Matilda, along with brother Richard, were accused of stealing goods. They managed to evade punishment, along with another sister who was accused of theft. Later in the same year, however, a 5th family member named John was found guilty of stealing clothes and other goods worth 8 shillings from a neighbour. At a time when the average labourer was earning 3 pennies a day, 8 shillings was worth on average a month's wages. It would seem that the Warrants were making a considerable living from their illegal activities. Unfortunately, stealing anything worth over 12 pence was seen as a serious crime, and John was hanged. Undeterred by the fate of their relative, the Warrants were back in trouble with the law again in 1325. This time, all 4 of the siblings were behind bars to await trial for stealing cloth worth 60 shillings, and the jailer was specifically instructed to inflict them with fortet jus, or strong and hard treatment, which probably meant some form of torture. But working together again, they managed to escape conviction. When put before a jury the following year, they were at it again. In February, the family were indicted for the theft of 32 cloths. and in August the two sisters were accused of stealing another 40 shillings worth. They were all acquitted on both occasions. There is no way of knowing how many other crimes the family committed or how they kept getting away with it. When they were brought before a court, we can only assume that they either gave up their life of crime or were never caught again, because they disappeared into the mists of medieval obscurity. It is surprising that the family was never actually convicted of any crimes, especially when we consider that the guilt of a suspect on trial in the Middle Ages was usually dependent on the reputation and character of the prisoner rather than evidence. Trials were very quick affairs, without the lengthy questioning of witnesses and drawn-out deliberations that we see today. Corruption. In 1249, some merchants from the Belgian province of Brabant complained to King Henry III that they had been robbed whilst conducting business in the county of Hampshire. Hampshire was a busy, thriving place, being home to the port of Southampton and the Palace of Winchester. The suspects were caught, put on trial, but acquitted. However, the merchants persisted in their complaint. King Henry took instruction from his councillors and was not happy to find that attacks on travellers were common in Hampshire, and there was a conspiracy to hide the crime from the justices, which involved jurors who were actually accomplices of the robbers. It seems that corruption was a huge problem, and many gangs had links to the rich and powerful, including knights and members of the nobility. The dishonesty went right to the very top. In 1350, Sir William Thorpe, the Chief Justice of the King's Bench, was jailed for accepting bribes. Perhaps this is why the warrants were never convicted, and why jury after jury found them innocent, despite their previous form and bad reputation. It's possible that they were involved in a conspiracy and sharing their stolen money with the very jurors who were deciding their fate, finding sanctuary. Of course, if you were a convicted criminal and you could make it to a church, you could always claim sanctuary. In medieval Europe, the most common crimes for which a fugitive would seek sanctuary were theft and murder. Once the outlaw was inside a cathedral or church, they were safe, as their pursuers were forbidden to enter by law. The felon could even take a bow, an arrow, or any other weapon into the church to attack their pursuers from the windows. Once safe inside, the hope was that an agreement might be reached with the injured party, and the offender would be given safe passage to leave. Unlike most European churches, where a person could only stay in sanctuary for 40 days, for the English there was no limit. In 12th century England, anyone claiming sanctuary had to go into permanent exile from their country, and could only return if given a royal pardon. Sanctuary followed by exile was better than going to prison. The food inside jail was bad and scarce, and disease was rife. Not many made it out alive. There were severe penalties for anyone who broke the laws of sanctuary. In 1284, Ralph of Aldgate was out walking with his mistress Alice at Bow, when a goldsmith named Lawrence Duquette insulted her and called her a fallen woman. Ouch! The two men began to fight, and Ralph was badly injured. Fearing that he would die, Lawrence fled to the church of St Mary le Bow nearby. Ralph actually survived, but Lawrence was later found hanging inside the church. Believing he had committed suicide because of guilt, his body was cut down, and he was thrown into a ditch to rot. But a witness came forward, who was hiding inside the church and had seen Alice and a group of Ralph's friends enter St Mary's and lynch Lawrence, hanging him from one of the mullions above a window. This was clearly a violation of the conditions of sanctuary, and the perpetrators were punished accordingly. Alice was burned at the stake, which was the usual method of execution for a murderess, and her 15 male co-conspirators were hanged. Self-killing. The body of poor Lawrence was treated with such contempt because the act of suicide was also seen as a crime. From as early as the 6th century, the Catholic Church viewed it as a form of murder and denied a suicide victim their formal funeral rite. By the 12th century, this so-called self-murder was seen as a crime in civil law as well as in religious law in Europe. Because it deprived a feudal lord of one of his chattels, the victim's property and belongings would be confiscated for the king's treasury instead of being given to the suicide's family. In early 15th century France, the law called for the house of a suicide victim to be demolished, his fields burned, and his woods chopped down. As if that wasn't enough, the body of a suicide victim, who was seen as nothing but a common criminal, would often be tortured. Some would be hanged or dragged through the streets by a horse, and others burned as a warning of the absolute atrocity of self-murder. In England, a suicide was buried at the crossroads, with a stake through the heart to pin the corpse to the ground. Bizarrely, it was thought that this would prevent the spirit from returning and causing any more mayhem. If the staking failed to hold the soul, then it would hopefully get confused by the crossroads and choose the wrong road, thereby going off to harass some other village or town. The actual amount of unlawful behaviour that occurred during the Middle Ages is hard to calculate, but as many social mischiefs were also criminalised, such as gambling, scolding, vagrancy, sexual offences and even eavesdropping, it would seem to be a time when both church and state were trying to gain social control over even the tiniest of wrongdoings. In the 1300s in northern France, a nasty character named Jacquemont bribed a jailer to let his unwanted son-in-law die a painful death in prison. Jacquemont then, with the help of his son, killed his nephew, Collart Cordel. The impoverished Cordel had followed Jacquemont during the harvest, trying to glean the wheat from behind him, but angered his uncle by coming too close. Jacquemont grabbed his nephew by his hood, hurled him brutally to the ground and spurred his horse to ride again and again over the crumpled body. It's an episode that might have been lifted from Game of Thrones. No wonder the era has become a byword for brutality. Indeed, during a brutal scene in the film Pulp Fiction, one of the characters menaces that, "I'm going to get medieval on your ass." There's no need to explain what this might involve because the stereotype of the violent, sadistic Middle Ages is well known to all of us. But how accurate is this stereotype? As the Jacquemont episode shows, there is plenty that is shocking and disturbing in the surviving records for the later Middle Ages. But even more striking is that medieval contemporaries were also horrified by such events. Of course, we only know about this case because it provoked a legal reaction. It wasn't seen as acceptable or even normal. Levels of interpersonal violence were certainly higher in the Middle Ages than today, but it's very hard to quantify this precisely, even more so if we add war and the horrors of genocide into the equation. In part, this is because the changing nature of legal prosecutions means that we are not comparing like with like. Definitions of criminal violence have also changed. For example, rape and domestic violence were defined very narrowly in the Middle Ages. The historian Lawrence Stone calculated that homicide levels in medieval England were at least 10 times what they are today. Certainly we cannot doubt that it was a dangerous time in which to live. An exceptional case, even by medieval standards, is provided by 14th century Oxford. Levels of violence there were considered unacceptably high by contemporaries. In the 1340s, the homicide rate was around 110 per 100,000. In the UK in 2011, it was 1 per 100,000. Why were levels of interpersonal violence so high in the Middle Ages? Historians have offered various explanations. Steven Pinker has put forward a psychological theory, claiming that humankind learned only recently to tame its most savage impulses. But this doesn't really account for the complexity of reactions to violence in the medieval period, as we shall see. Others have pointed to the prevalence of alcohol and the fact that many people were wandering around armed with daggers and other knives on a daily basis. There were no permanent police forces as there are now, and in many cases the capture of a perpetrator depended on the cooperation of the community. Moreover, in an era of rudimentary medical care, many died from wounds that might today be successfully treated. There are more complex explanations too. These were cultures in which honour was paramount and violence was recognised as a means of communicating certain messages. If you hacked off a woman's nose, for example, most people would recognise this as a signifier of adultery. They were also profoundly unequal cultures, characterised, particularly from the 14th century, by high levels of social unrest. Sociologists and historians have been able to demonstrate a correlation between levels of inequality and levels of violence, which is particularly compelling for late medieval Europe. Homicides varied from premeditated attacks to tavern brawls that ended in disaster. Often these were over-exuberant episodes gone horribly wrong. In 1304, for example, one Gerlach de Wetzlaria, provost of a church in the Diocese of Salzburg, applied for a pardon for killing a fellow student many years earlier when a playful sword fight had ended in tragedy. Carrying out acts of violence seems to have been as much about proving oneself in front of one's peers and belonging to a group as it was about the victim, which probably explains why men in gangs were responsible for much of the mayhem. This sense of fraternity characterises a group of men led by Robert Stafford. Stafford was a chaplain. Perhaps because of his clerical status, he wittily named himself Frere Tuck, after the figure from the Robin Hood legends. His gang's actions mostly took the form of poaching and offences against property, though there were more brutal undertones. Apparently, they threatened the gamekeepers with death or mutilation. Female victims. It is much rarer to find women perpetrating violent crime. More often they were the victims. It is very difficult to assess levels of rape because the offence was subject to changing definitions, most of which would appear far too narrow to our modern eyes. Women had to be able to physically demonstrate their lack of consent and risk their reputations and punishment themselves in doing so. The odds were loaded against them. Cases that were eventually reported tended to be particularly brutal. In 1438, one Thomas Elam attacked Margaret Perman. He broke into her house, attempted to rape her, and feloniously bit Margaret with his teeth, so that he ripped off the nose of the said Margaret with that bite and broke 3 of her ribs there. The case came to court because she died from her wounds. Elam was condemned to be hanged. Definitions of domestic violence were also radically different in the later Middle Ages. Most acts of aggression that we would deem to be criminal were then thought of simply as acceptable discipline. If a wife disobeyed her husband, it was thought right and proper that she should be punished. Domestic violence does, though, sometimes appear in the records of ecclesiastical courts when a wife sued for divorce, or in criminal records when the violence resulted in permanent maiming, miscarriage, or death. How to distinguish between levels of acceptable domestic discipline and unacceptable domestic violence was an ongoing problem. One famous solution often cited was the rule of thumb, whereby it's claimed it was acceptable to beat your wife as long as the stick you used was thinner than your thumb. However, in reality, discussions were more sophisticated and less conclusive than this. In 1326 in Paris, one Colin Le Barbier hit his wife with a billiard stick so hard that she died. He was tried in a criminal court and found guilty of murder. However, he appealed and claimed that his wife deserved her suffering because she had nagged him so relentlessly in public. He said that he had not meant to kill her. He meant only to scare her so that she would be quiet. However, the stick accidentally entered into her thigh a little above the knee. The reason she had died, he added, was because she failed to tend the wound properly, rather than because he had mistreated her. His subsequent acquittal tells us a lot about attitudes in this period. Homicide, rape and domestic violence could be found across the social spectrum. However, some kinds of violence were more common in certain milieux. Violent theft was most often perpetrated by people on the economic margins of society who stole out of desperation. It peaked during periods of particular deprivation, such as the horrific famine of the 1310s in which as much as 25% of the population died. England in the 14th and 15th centuries was also notorious for the prevalence of frightening gangs, often comprising gentry or even noblemen. These marauded around the countryside, plundering and leaving a trail of blood in their wake. In 1332, for example, the Fulville gang was accused of kidnapping a royal official. They had already killed a baron of the Exchequer. These were young men who quite literally thought themselves to be beyond the law, often involved in feuds and vendettas, and for whom honour was a key concept. A question of honour. Honour-driven violence was also prevalent at the top of the social tree. During periods of weak kingship, violence by noblemen could reach terrifying levels. In early 15th century France, with a king, Charles VI, the Mad, intermittently suffering from paranoid schizophrenia and believing himself to be made of glass, powerful warring nobles were able to seize control, the result was spiralling violence that culminated in the 1407 assassination of the Duke of Orleans, and ultimately the English entry into France. Things were not much rosier for the English. In the second half of the 15th century, the weakness of the reigning monarch, Henry VI, and the accumulation of huge retinues by hostile aristocrats were, at least in large part, responsible for the Wars of the Roses. The lines between interpersonal violence, civil war, and full-blown war were indistinct. At the other end of the social spectrum, in the later Middle Ages, the growing structural inequalities created by rapid commercialization and urbanization, as well as competing forms of government, generated a series of riots and revolts. Plotted on a map, these are concentrated along the main trading belt of Europe, from London to Paris and the Netherlands, through the markets of Champagne to the commercial heartlands of northern Italy. The most famous examples: the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, the Champy Revolt of 1378 in Florence, and the Paris Rebellion and Jacquerie Revolt in northern France in 1358, all involved complex alliances of rebels from various social groups demanding greater representation, railing against corruption, and protesting their economic marginalization. Revolts along social lines sometimes overlapped with violence driven by religion. Famously, medieval Europe was marked by waves of popular religious persecution, with anti-Semitism rearing its ugly head with depressing frequency. Yet perhaps the most violent dimension of medieval life was that of the law, which carried out its own gruesome rituals. Punishment was intended to be spectacular. Most serious crimes were punishable by hanging, but plenty more imaginative ways of disposing of criminals were employed. In many areas of Europe, those found guilty of forging money were boiled alive. This obsession with providing a spectacle of violence, to emphasize the guilt of the accused and to deter and awe observers, led to some almost farcical episodes. An old man questioned in the 1390s remembered how, when he was young, he saw a man hanged for murder. The body was cut down from the gibbet by a competing jurisdiction and rehanged, only for the original jurisdiction to construct a straw effigy that they hanged. Reactions to violence. We're left then with a picture of an extraordinarily violent society. Though it's very difficult to arrive at precise numbers, it's clear that this is not a society one would wish to visit for any length of time. There is, though, a flip side to all of this. The evidence suggests that, though violence was common, people were not simply inured to it. On the contrary, they really cared about it. This is not to say that violence was simply deemed to be wrong. Rather, it was a problem about which people worried and talked. The ethos of chivalry represents one way in which attempts were made to channel violence. Chivalric custom suggested that one should fight only with certain kinds of weapons, that one should seek only worthy opponents, and that one should exercise mercy and generosity. The reality was that chivalry underpinned some of the most brutal and bloodiest episodes in our history, notably the 100 Years' War. But the point remains that this was a set of customs arising out of concern and a sense that violence can be a problem. The most important clue that people worried about violence is the fact that they wrote about it. Medieval literature is full of descriptions of torture, but close readings of these texts show that torturers were demonized. Such a strategy would work only if people felt torture to be profoundly problematic, and they certainly did think it a problem. In 14th century France, criminal courts usually subjected the evidence gained from torture to extra scrutiny because it was deemed unreliable. Law and order was very harsh in medieval England. Those in charge of law and order believed that people would only learn how to behave properly if they feared what would happen to them if they broke the law. Even the smallest offences had serious punishments. The authorities feared the poor simply because there were many more poor than rich, and any revolt could be potentially damaging, as the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 proved. By the time of Henry II, the system of law in England had been improved because Henry sent out his own judges from London to listen to cases throughout all England's counties. Each accused person had to go through an ordeal. There were 3 ordeals. Ordeal by fire. An accused person held a red-hot iron bar and walked 3 paces. His hand was then bandaged and left for 3 days. If the wound was getting better after 3 days, you were innocent. If the wound had clearly not got any better, you were guilty. Ordeal by water. An accused person was tied up and thrown into water. If you floated, you were guilty of the crime you were accused of. Ordeal by combat. This was used by noblemen who had been accused of something. They would fight in combat with their accuser. Whoever won was right. Whoever lost was usually dead at the end of the fight. In 1215, the Pope decided that priests in England must not help with ordeals. As a result, ordeals were replaced by trials by juries. To start with, these were not popular with the people, as they felt that their neighbours might have a grudge against them and use the opportunity of a trial to get their revenge. After 1275, a law was introduced which allowed people to be tortured if they refused to go to trial before a jury. If you were found guilty of a crime, you would expect to face a severe punishment. Thieves had their hands cut off. Women who committed murder were strangled and then burnt. People who illegally hunted in royal parks had their ears cut off, and high treason was punishable by being hung, drawn and quartered. There were very few prisons as they cost money, and local communities were not prepared to pay for their upkeep. It was cheaper to execute someone for bad crimes or mutilate them and then let them go. Most towns had a gibbet just outside of it. People were hung on these and their bodies left to rot over the weeks as a warning to others. However, such violent punishments clearly did not put off people. In 1202, the city of Lincoln in England had 114 murders, 89 violent robberies, and 65 people were wounded in fights. Only 2 people were executed for these crimes, and it can be concluded that many in Lincoln got away with their crime. How do you deal with a thief? You cut off one of his hands. Drug dealers should be hanged. Women who have committed adultery should be stoned to death. Although such punishments are inconceivable in the Netherlands, this is the harsh reality abroad. The instruments of correction in the prison gate show that here too punishments used to be humiliating and gruesome. Convictions were followed by horrific scenes. For 400 years the prison gate served as the prison of the Court of Holland, not as a prison for convicted offenders, but as a house of detention. The accused would await their sentences here, sentences that could result in fines, banishment, or horrific scenes. There were roughly 3 kinds of punishments: public humiliation, corporal punishment, and the death penalty. Public humiliation, being made to look a fool in front of everyone. Public humiliation was intended as a deterrent and to establish the state's monopoly on violence. Nowadays, a suspect will be the focus of media attention until they are sentenced. Once the suspect has been sent to prison, the media coverage falls silent. For centuries, though, the opposite was true. The condemned was then punished in front of the largest possible audience. This was because humiliation formed an important part of the punishment, certainly for punishments such as the stocks or pillory. If convicted, you would be put in the stocks or tied to the pillory, or you would have to walk through the market dragging a stone of shame. Members of the public were allowed to shout insults and pelt you with rotten fruit, sometimes even with excrement. The crime that you had committed was announced on a placard known as a placard of shame. Corporal punishment, from temporary pain to permanent mutilation. Corporal punishment went a step further. These forms of punishment caused temporary pain and discomfort, such as beatings and whippings. There were also punishments that led to permanent mutilation, such as branding, chopping off limbs, or mutilating someone's tongue, nose, eyes, or ears. With a split nose or the brand of the city on your forehead, not only had you endured a painful experience, but everyone could see for the rest of your life that you had committed a crime. You're born in a nest high up in a tree. It's not fancy, just a pile of sticks held together with luck, but it does the job. Mum and Dad hover around, calling their approval like they've just built a luxury condo. Inside the nest, it's crowded. Your siblings are loud, pushy, and just as hungry as you. There's no such thing as taking turns. If you want food, you squawk louder than everyone else. Mum stays close, keeping you warm, while Dad flies back and forth with food. He works hard, bringing worms, insects and whatever else he can scavenge. Occasionally he shows up with something that probably was not meant for birds, but you eat it anyway. Sometimes he gets help from other crows. Helpers are like the unpaid interns of the bird world, and they pitch in when there are too many beaks to feed. At first, the food is soft and pre-wet. It is not exactly appetising, but when Mum leans over and drops it into your beak, you're not in a position to be picky. After a week or two, the menu expands to include chunkier options. Worms, beetles and other solid snacks become the new normal. You're growing fast, and apparently that takes a lot of fuel. Beyond the nest, there's a whole world out there, but you don't care about that yet. Your only real priority is making sure you don't accidentally tumble out of the nest. It's a long drop, and you're pretty sure you wouldn't bounce. At around 1 month, Mum decides it's time for you to learn how to fly. You're not sure how wings are supposed to work, but you flap them anyway. Your first attempt ends with a graceful belly flop onto a lower branch. Not ideal. The second try is worse. You miss the branch entirely and end up in a pile of leaves on the ground. If anyone asks, you meant to do that. After a few days of bruised pride and questionable aerodynamics, you finally manage to stay in the air. Flying feels incredible, until you realise you have no idea how to land. You aim for a branch, misjudge entirely, and slam into it sideways. But hey, at least you're airborne now. Flying also comes with responsibilities. Suddenly everyone expects you to keep up with the family. Mum swoops effortlessly through the trees while you're flapping along like a busted kite. There's no time for breaks either. Hawks are always watching, and they love a wobbly rookie like you. And then there's food. Mum points to the ground, and you're supposed to figure out how to grab a beetle mid-flight. You dive down with all the confidence in the world, only to end up with a beak full of dirt. Mum just stares at you, probably wondering how you're even related. Flying is harder than it looks, but you're a crow. You've got this. Well, eventually. Here's the thing about your species. You're very smart. At first, though, you don't know much. You learn by watching. You keep an eye on the older crows, how they dig through the dirt for insects, flip over leaves to find hidden snacks, or pull scraps out of tricky places. You're not great at it yet, but you copy them until you figure it out. If one of them drops a nut from a branch to crack it open, you're right there trying the same thing. Shortly after, you also learn about predators. You don't start out knowing which animals are dangerous, so you follow the adult's lead. Hear that sharp, urgent caw? That means danger. You don't stop to think. You duck into cover and stay still. Over time, you pick up on the patterns. You learn which shapes in the sky mean trouble and which ones don't. Social skills come next. The adults communicate constantly. Caws, postures, little gestures you hadn't noticed before. You mimic those too, learning how to fit in without causing too much trouble. It's a lot to pick up, but you're getting there. And then there are humans. They leave food everywhere. Scraps, crumbs, and leftovers. You figure out where they drop things when they're distracted, and how to grab what you want without getting too close. Some humans even offer food. Others try to shoo you away, which is hilarious, because you remember faces. If they cross you once, you'll make sure they regret it later. Revenge isn't just satisfying, it's efficient. At some point you realise it's not just you, your siblings and your parents out there. There's a bigger picture. The local murder, your extended family and a few neighbours become your social circle. It's chaotic, but somehow comforting. Foraging with the murder is your first real group activity. If someone finds food, word spreads fast and everyone shows up uninvited. It's not exactly a cooperative effort, more of a free-for-all, but the numbers work in your favour. More eyes mean more chances to spot something edible. Then there's the warning system. If a predator shows up, the whole group rallies. One crow spots it, and within seconds the alarm call spreads. You scream too, because why not? It's very loud and strangely effective. Hawks, dogs, cats, and other threats learn quickly that this neighbourhood is not worth the trouble. Fitting in takes some effort. You watch the older crows to learn the unspoken rules, who to approach, who to avoid, and how to hold your own without stepping on too many feathers. It's a delicate balance, but you get the hang of it. The murder might seem like chaos from the outside, but it works. There's safety in numbers, a constant buzz of activity, and a sense that, even in the mess, you're part of something bigger. As you get older, you start spending less time with your family group. You still stick close to the murder, but your focus shifts to exploring on your own. The pull toward independence feels natural. There's a whole world out there, and it's time to see what it has to offer. Foraging becomes a solo activity. You explore new territories, testing your skills at finding food. Sometimes it's a win, like stumbling across a perfectly intact sandwich. Other times it's a humbling experience, like when you mistake a piece of plastic for something edible. Trial and error is part of the process, and you're quick to learn what's worth grabbing and what isn't. Independence has its risks. Without a sentinel crow keeping watch, you have to rely entirely on your instincts. A rustle in the bushes or a shadow passing overhead means you freeze, assess, and act fast. Most of the time you're quick enough to avoid danger, but there are close calls, like the time you nearly became a hawk's lunch. You've learned that sharp reflexes and a healthy dose of caution go a long way. Even though you're forging your own path, the murder is always there. When food is scarce or predators are a little too bold, you rejoin the group. Foraging together is easier, and mobbing predators is far safer with backup. Independence feels good, but so is having a safety net. One afternoon, you're minding your own business, poking around for something to eat, when a fox comes out of nowhere. It jumps, charging straight at you. You flap your wings like mad and barely make it to a branch. The fox jumps after you, snapping at your tail feathers, but you're faster. You let out a sharp call, an alarm call, and within seconds, reinforcements arrive. The murder swarms in, dive-bombing the fox from every angle. You join in, swooping just close enough to make it flinch. The fox yelps, spins and bolts, running for its life as the crows chase it all the way out of the area. You shake yourself off and hop to a higher branch. Crisis averted. Stupid fox. When spring rolls around, you decide it's time to find a mate. You don't rush it. Picking the right partner is important. To impress a potential mate, you pull out all the stops. A bit of aerial acrobatics here, some confident calls there. It's not subtle, but it gets the job done. Once she agrees, you seal the deal with some mutual grooming and food sharing. With your partnership established, the two of you get to work on the nest. You both gather twigs, moss, and whatever else looks nest-worthy, hauling it up to the highest branch you can find. Predators can't climb trees, right? That's the theory anyway. After a lot of back and forth, and probably a few disagreements, the nest is done. It's sturdy and completely functional. Good enough. Soon after, your mate lays a clutch of 3 eggs. Her job is to sit on them, keeping them warm for the next few weeks. Your job? Everything else. You spend your days flying around, bringing her food and making sure nothing with claws or sharp teeth gets too close. It's exhausting, but the eggs eventually hatch, and that's when the real work begins. Now it's a tag team operation. You both take turns hunting for insects, worms, and whatever else the chicks can swallow. They're loud, constantly hungry, and completely dependent on you. To make things even more interesting, some of the other crows show up to help. They mean well, but let's just say their enthusiasm doesn't always match their usefulness. Over the next month, the chicks grow fast. They start out as tiny, awkward bundles of fluff, but before long, they're flapping their wings and testing their limits. You teach them the basics: how to find food, how to spot predators, and most importantly, how to survive without falling out of the tree. It's a steep learning curve, but they'll manage. You've built a life, raised chicks, and earned your place in the murder. You'd think things might slow down, but no. Life as a crow is a full-time job. Foraging is still a mix of strategy and sheer luck. You've learned where the best scraps are. bins, picnic tables, human leftovers, but so is everyone else. It's a race to get there first, and someone's always trying to snatch your prize. Then there's the constant need to stay sharp. From a hawk to a cat, everything out there is probably trying to eat you. You mob those predators until they run away, annoyed but unharmed. Even humans can be a problem. Some are kind enough to toss food your way, while others swing brooms like you've declared war on their garden. You never know what to expect, and yet, it's not all stress. Every so often you get a chance to explore. You mess with sticks, test out new ways to open tough shells, and sometimes just watch the world below from your perch. Your curiosity keeps you sharp, but it also gets you into trouble. This is life at its peak. Cleverness, survival, and keeping one step ahead of everything and everyone. It's not glamorous, but you wouldn't have it any other way. But soon, everything will change. One day, while you're perched on a branch, a hawk comes out of nowhere. You do not even see it coming. There is no warning, no chance to react. In an instant, you are pushed from the tree and fall to the ground like a stone. A while later, a human walks by. They see your body and crouch down, tilting their head like they're trying to figure out what went wrong. They poke you gently, maybe even whisper something, not realizing you are beyond help. Your murder watches from the trees. To them, this is clear-cut. The human killed you. That is all they need to know. From that day on, they make the human's life miserable. They scream at him every time he walks by, dive bomb him, and make sure he never feels safe outside again. He has no idea why you're gone. But your group remembers, not just through the tricks you taught them, but by turning their rage into a lifetime grudge. You've woken up to the unmistakable stench of 150 unwashed men, dried fish, vomit, and the haunting scent of something that died weeks ago and never left. The sun's not even up yet, but the hold is already a swamp of body heat and regret. You slept in your clothes because pirates don't own pyjamas, and even if they did, they'd just get stolen. Your shirt is stuck to your back. Your hair is a rat's nest soaked in salt, sweat, and questionable life decisions. And your first thought of the day is, why does my mouth taste like cannon smoke and old rum? No toothpaste, no toothbrush, no minty fresh anything. You rinse your mouth with watered down grog and pretend that counts. Now, getting up, that's its own sport. Because the moment you try to stretch, you bang your head on the low wooden ceiling, kick someone else's peg leg, and narrowly avoid stepping on a rat that's somehow fatter than the ship's cook. Congratulations, you're awake. Time for work. Except you're not walking into an office. You're climbing into chaos. You haul yourself up to the deck, half blind from the sun, and already nursing a crick in your neck that feels like it was inflicted by Neptune himself. And what greets you? A crew of the loudest, smelliest, most creatively vulgar men ever assembled. Half of them are hungover. The other half are still drunk. Someone's already puking off the side. Another guy is singing sea shanties at full volume, off-key, while holding a sword, naked. You're greeted by your quartermaster who hates you, barking orders in a voice that sounds like gravel being chewed by a demon. Rig the sails, swab the deck, scrape the barnacles off the hull before they start charging rent. You haven't even eaten. And speaking of food, breakfast. If you're lucky, it's salted beef so old it's legally considered a fossil, or hardtack, a biscuit so hard it can and has broken teeth. If you're unlucky, you get weevils in your biscuit. If you're really unlucky, you get a biscuit in your weevils. Protein. And don't you dare complain, because the cook will hear you. And this man once stabbed someone with a fishbone for saying his soup was a little watery. Now, back to work. You're climbing masts, tying ropes, scrubbing decks, all while being blasted with ocean spray, sunburned into jerky, and dodging flying seagull poop like it's a sniper. Every step is slippery, every rope is frayed, and everything smells like the ocean got into a bar fight and lost. You think pirates just sailed around, drank rum and sang songs? Wrong. You're fixing sails in a storm. You're patching holes in a ship that's more woodworm than wood. You're praying to sea gods you don't even believe in because a storm cloud just blinked at you. You haven't bathed in 3 weeks. Your clothes are salt stiff. Your socks are a science experiment. And your boots? filled with seawater, toe blisters and regret. Oh, and that romantic idea of freedom? Sure, you're free. Free to get scurvy, free to catch lice, free to lose your leg to an infected splinter and have it amputated by the ship's surgeon, a guy whose only qualification is once watched someone else do it. But you've got treasure, right? Gold? Jewels? Riches beyond imagination? Nope. You're being paid in shares, and your share is currently being held hostage by the captain because you looked at him funny. Also, there's a bounty on your head in 3 different countries, 2 of which you've never even been to. How? Because pirate bureaucracy makes no sense. You want to quit? Too bad. There's nowhere to go. You're in the middle of the ocean, no lifeboats, no escape, no HR department. Just you, your new best friend named Stabby Pete, and a never-ending cycle of wet socks, rotten food, and existential crises brought on by the sound of the sea whispering, "You did this to yourself." And this is just morning. You haven't even had your first cannon fight yet. Welcome to pirate life. You wouldn't last a day. Alright. So you've survived the wake-up call, which was really just a combination of blinding sunlight, suspicious smells, and being shouted at by a man with 3 teeth and a deep hatred of mornings. Now it's time to eat. Or at least try. Because food on a pirate ship wasn't so much meals, as it was a daily gamble between mild disgust and this might actually kill me. Let's start with the basics. You get hardtack, which is a biscuit in the same way that a brick is a pillow. It's flour, water and lies, baked until it's roughly the density of a neutron star. You can't bite into it without risking dental reconstruction, so the trick is to soak it in grog or soup until it's soft enough to stop breaking teeth. But you know what else likes hardtack? Weevils, little beetle things that live inside the biscuit. You try not to look too closely because if it's moving, well, that's just extra protein. Some pirates would eat in the dark so they didn't have to watch their breakfast crawl. Now, on special days, and by special, I mean someone hasn't died this week, you might get salted meat. Sounds good, right? Until you realise this meat's been sitting in a barrel for months, soaking in brine until it's turned into salty leather with the flavour of regret and barnacle runoff. You don't chew it, you negotiate with it. Like, please, just break down in my mouth before I die of exhaustion. And then there's the dried peas, not fresh peas, not nice green plump peas, dried. So dry they make sand look hydrated. They get boiled into a mushy, greyish paste that smells like disappointment, and tastes like it too. Soup was common, and by soup I mean mystery sludge. Everything went in, rat bones, old vegetables, that one fish someone dropped on the deck yesterday. You didn't ask what was in it. You just hoped it didn't scream when you poked it. Now, if your ship's cook was creative, you might get some bizarre dishes. Pickled seaweed, fermented fish guts. Once, on a particularly desperate voyage, a crew reportedly made stew out of old leather belts. Boiled them, ate them, probably gave them a nostalgic chew toy texture. And let's not forget the rum. Ah yes, the pirate classic. Except you didn't just drink rum, you lived on it. Why? Because water went bad. After a week in the barrel, water turned green, grew slime and developed personality. So you drank grog, a mix of rum and water. Or if your captain hated you, vinegar and water. Because nothing says refreshing beverage like sipping salad dressing in 40-degree heat. Scurvy? Absolutely. You'd be lucky to see a single piece of fruit in 6 months. If someone brought a lemon on board, it was basically a religious relic, a sacred orb of citrusy salvation. And just in case this isn't grim enough, the food was rationed. Small portions twice a day, with the consistency of gravel and the nutritional value of soggy cardboard wrapped in salt. If you got caught stealing extra rations, you'd be whipped. If you got caught hoarding food, you'd be flogged. If you got caught complaining about the food, you'd be handed more food and told to shut up, or tossed overboard, depending on how annoying you were. And yet, somehow, the cook, the man responsible for this daily digestive trauma, was untouchable. You didn't mess with him, because he controlled the knives. and he knew how to make a man disappear into a pot of soup so fast it would make your head spin. So what did you eat as a pirate? Whatever hadn't rotted yet, whatever hadn't grown eyes, and whatever the cook didn't throw at you for asking dumb questions. What did you wish you could eat? Literally anything else. A fresh apple, a warm loaf of bread, a piece of meat that wasn't 40% salt and 60% despair. But you don't get those things. Because you're a pirate. You don't eat to enjoy. You eat to survive. And if you survive long enough, maybe, just maybe, one day you'll get your hands on a slice of lemon. And when you do, it'll taste like heaven dipped in sunshine, assuming you still have enough teeth to bite it. Alright, you've woken up in a floating stink box. You've gnawed through breakfast like a desperate raccoon. Now it's time to get to work. Because piracy, spoiler alert, it's not just dramatic sword fights and treasure maps drawn by guys with suspicious eye injuries. Number, it's work. And not the kind where you sit in a cubicle and steal office pens. The kind where you sweat through your clothes, bleed into your socks, and maybe lose a finger before lunch. Let's say you're not the captain. Because of course you're not. You're you. You're the guy who joined the crew thinking, "Yeah, this'll be fun." And now you're realising it's mostly just blisters and yelling. Your day begins with ship duties, which is a cute phrase that means every horrible thing that keeps this creaking coffin from sinking. You're scrubbing the deck, which sounds simple until you realise it's covered in old blood, fish guts, spilled grog, and at least 3 bodily fluids you'd rather not identify. You're using seawater, no soap, no gloves, just a brush and a prayer. Then it's sail work. Climbing up the rigging, sometimes 60 feet in the air, with wind screaming in your ears and the constant threat of falling to your death, or getting clocked by a swinging yard arm. And here's the best part. You're doing all this on a moving ship, with the ocean trying to body slam you off the mast like Poseidon's in a bad mood. Still alive? Great. Now you're coiling ropes. South many. Ropes. Ropes for sails. Ropes for anchors. Ropes for tying up prisoners. Ropes for tying up you if you screw up enough times. After that, maintenance. You're fixing sails, patching leaks,